Hamburger Heist. A Felicia's Food Truck Mystery. Book 2. By Celia Kinsey, writing as Abby Byne. You are listening to an AI-narrated full audio mystery. If you'd rather read this story, a link to the ebook version is in the description. Chapter 1. I was at the supermarket bakery counter trying to order a birthday cake for my cook and best friend in the world, Arnie, when I got the call. The woman on the other end was hysterical. Something bad had happened at the food truck, but I wasn't at all clear on what it was, other than a gun had been involved at some point. Who is this again? I had to ask. It's Emmeline, the hysterical voice on the other end informed me. Felicia, something terrible has happened. Emmeline was one of our regulars. She always came with her dog, Buddy. Buddy was a cocker spaniel who thought he was human, or at least that he was entitled to eat like one. This did not go down well with Arnie's dachshund Frank, who spent most of his days dozing in the shade under the food truck. Frank's idea of gourmet was roadkill that had been run over at regular intervals for a minimum of 48 hours. Start again from the beginning, Emmeline, I said as I stepped into a quiet corner next to the donut display. Speak slowly. Is anyone hurt? No, she said. Nobody's hurt, but it was so scary. What's all this about a gun? I asked. He pointed a gun at Arnie's head and made him give up all the money in the register. Then he asked for 3 hamburgers. Done rare. Arnie asked for hamburgers? No, the robber did. He stood there waiting for Arnie to cook the hamburgers. Then he took a bite out of one of them and made Arnie do them all over again. Why? The robber said the patties were too well done. But nobody's hurt? I asked again, just to be sure. It gave me a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach to think about anything happening to Arnie. I may look like I have it all together, but I wasn't at all sure I'd be able to function without him. Not even for a week. No, nobody's hurt, Emmeline repeated. Arnie's talking to the police. I'll be right over, I told her. I hung up and turned back to Franny, the woman who was working behind the bakery counter. Franny and I used to waitress together at Bert's coffee shop long before I branched out on my own with the food truck. Franny has always been chatty. I hoped she hadn't heard my end of the phone conversation or no telling what kind of story would be flying around the town of Brebe by the time the evening rolled around. When did you say this Jack's person would be back? I asked Franny. Early tomorrow morning, she said. He got off not half an hour ago, you barely missed him. Are you sure I can't just leave him a note or something? It's not like I want anything elaborate. No, Franny insisted. Jax is a terrific baker but very particular, especially when it comes to cakes. He likes to speak to customers in person. He'll be in tomorrow morning. Then she mumbled something under her breath. What did you say? I almost didn't ask because all I could think about was that someone had just pulled a gun on Arnie, but Franny's furtive manner intrigued me. It's nothing, Franny insisted. It was something. I just said Jax would be in tomorrow unless he stays up all night again and oversleeps his alarm. Does that happen a lot? Sometimes. Well, insomnia can be a challenge. Jax stays up on purpose, Franny said, lowering her voice to a whisper. He has a gambling problem. We don't have a casino within driving distance, so that couldn't be it. You mean online gambling? Franny nodded and then skittered off as the store manager walked up. It was only a couple of blocks from the supermarket to the food truck. I keep the truck parked in a vacant lot next to Hank's car wash. The graveled lot isn't very big. There are parking spaces for only 5 cars, plus the little tables we keep out in front in case somebody wants to eat their burgers on the spot. When I drove up, the parking lot was jammed. Emmeline was still there. 2 police cars, parked so crooked they were taking up 2 spaces each, occupied the remaining slots. I could see Officer Finch and another policeman I didn't know talking to Arnie. I pulled into Hank's car wash and parked my old pickup around the back. Hank wouldn't mind. "You're sure you have no idea who it was?" Officer Finch was asking Arnie when I walked up. Scott Finch was my boyfriend back in high school, which was a very long time ago, but he still seems to think we're going to get back together any day now. "All I can tell you is that it was definitely a man," Arnie told Scott. "He was around 6 feet, maybe a little shorter, very thin. He was wearing faded blue jeans and a plaid flannel shirt. The shirt was mostly yellow with blue and green checks." "I know you say you couldn't see his face because of the mask," Officer Finch said, "but what about his hands? Surely they must have given you some idea of his age." "He was wearing gloves," Arnie told Scott. "He wasn't elderly, but he could have been anywhere from 16 to a youthful 66. "He was wearing a mask?" I said. Arnie looked a little shaken. I wanted to give him a hug, but hugging wasn't something Arnie and I did. "The perpetrator was wearing one of those Darth Vader voice-changing masks," Scott informed me as if it was his story to tell. "Arnold can't even tell me what the assailant's voice sounded like. He managed to make it sound like a personal failure on Arnie's part." "Emmeline said something about a gun," I said. Emmeline was hanging around in the background, trying to keep Buddy and Frank from getting into a fight while she waited to have her statement taken down. As soon as I'd shown up, the second officer had disappeared around the back of the food truck. I supposed he was looking for evidence. "Well, Mr. Robbins," the second officer said to Arnie as he emerged from around the back, "you'll be relieved to know that your life was never in danger." Chapter 2. The officer held up a clear plastic evidence bag with a handgun inside. "I found it in the alley back behind the truck. It's not functional," the officer explained, "just a realistic-looking toy. If it had been Scott who'd discovered the fake gun, he'd have managed to make it sound like it was Arnie's fault for not knowing the difference, but this other officer was a professional." "That's a relief," I said. "How much money did he take?" Scott asked Arnie. "I can't be sure since we don't count it out until the end of the day," Arnie told him. "We start the day with 200 in the register," I told Officer Finch. "And we take in around 300 at lunchtime, give or take, so on an average day, there would have been between 500 and 600 in the register." 201, Arnie corrected me. "We always start out with 201. Officer Finch looked confused, but I knew what Arnie meant. My cook was referring to the Morgan silver dollar he kept in the register. Arnie's grandpa gave it to him when he was a kid, and Arnie always kept it with him for good luck. At some point, Arnie's younger brother had gotten a hold of the silver dollar and used the tip of his pocket knife to carve Lady Liberty a nice bushy mustache on her upper lip. It's not a collector's item anymore, but it's still precious to Arnie. "Don't tell me the robber took your silver dollar, too," I said to Arnie. "He did." The police officers lingered for another 10 minutes, taking down Emmeline's witness statement and poking around the perimeter of the food truck. As soon as they left, Hank wandered over to see what was going on. He runs a small tool rental business out of the tiny office at the back of the car wash, but lately, I'd noticed he wasn't open very often. "Not been feeling well, Hank?" I asked him. "Physically, I'm fine," Hank said. "It's just that grandson of mine who's driving me crazy." I was vaguely aware that Hank had grandchildren, but I couldn't recall that he ever talked about them. "I didn't know you had family in town," I said. "I don't. My son moved to Montana several years back," said Hank. But my namesake, Hank Jr., has been causing trouble again, and my daughter-in-law got this bright idea that they'd pawn him off on me for a while. They were under the delusion that I'd be able to set that boy straight. What kind of trouble has Hank Jr. gotten himself into? Oh, nothing that serious. He hasn't gotten arrested or anything, it's just that the kid has no ambition. So, you haven't succeeded in whipping him into shape yet, metaphorically speaking? Hank snorted and kicked at the tire of the food truck. That boy stays up half the night playing video games. He's 18 years old, but he refuses to sign up for any classes at the community college over at Eagles Rest. I told him, fine. You don't have to go to school. You can work instead, but he won't get a job. Surely you must like something about living with him, I said. He must be company for you. I hate that expression, Hank said. He scowled at me. Come to think of it, I hate that expression, too. I don't know why I used it on Hank. I deserve to be scowled at. He's thin as a rail, but I can't get him to eat any decent food, Hank groused. All he wants is potato chips, donuts, and pizza. He drinks about 3 gallons of soda a day. He likes your hamburgers, though. I take a few home for him when I'm not too dadgummed aggravated with him. That's nice. If you're so keen on having company, Hank suggested, still scowling, perhaps you'd like to take Hank Jr. off my hands for a while? I pictured a surly half-man/half-child permanently installed on my sofa, surrounded by empty soda cans and pizza boxes. No, thanks, I said. I'm happy with my solitude. I'd have sent him back home already, Hank said, if I hadn't been so foolish as to insist that he had to buy his own bus ticket back to Montana. I should have just bought him the blamed ticket when he asked for it, but now I've backed myself into a corner. I'll probably still be stuck with him when he's 40. There must be something you enjoy doing together? I persisted. Well, Hank Jr. does like Star Wars, Hank said grudgingly. We're rewatching the original trilogy together, so I guess the boy can't be all bad. Hank Sr. is a big Star Wars fan. He has tons of Star Wars memorabilia decorating his rental office next door. You don't happen to have one of those Darth Vader voice-changing masks, do you? I couldn't resist asking. Funny you should ask about that, Hank said. I had one of those on a shelf over my desk at the car wash, but just last week, it disappeared. Chapter 3. Did you report your Darth Vader mask as stolen? I asked. Nah, Hank said. Those masks are a dime a dozen. You can get those anywhere this time of year. Just last week, I saw that Walmart over in Eagles Rest had their Halloween stuff out already, and there was a whole display of them. After that, Hank wandered back over to the car wash. I didn't have the heart to quiz him as to whether Hank Jr. was partial to plaid. I sent Arnie home early, although he insisted that he didn't want to go. I could tell he was shaken, and, as I pointed out, it was hardly likely we'd be held up twice on the same day. It was a one-off, I tried to reassure him. We could be here another 20 years and never get held up again. Bray Bay's not exactly a hotbed of criminal activity. Arnie left, taking Frank with him. Frank had slept through the whole robbery and hadn't woken up until it was all over when Buddy had gone sniffing around under the truck in search of dropped French fries. Emmeline hates when Buddy eats stuff off the ground. She claims it gives him indigestion. I personally think Frank's indigestion is the result of a steady diet of fried foods and wolfing down mustard packets whole when Emmeline isn't looking. It was dead quiet, so I decided to give the interior of the truck a good cleaning. We do a lot of frying, and grease tends to build up. I hate dealing with grease, though, so I decided to start with something easier, the stainless steel shelf underneath the serving window on the side of the truck. Usually, the stainless steel shelf is covered with greasy fingerprints and globs of splashed condiments from the squeeze bottles we keep out for diners to help themselves, but today there was something I'd never seen before. Along the front of the shelf, directly in front of the cash register, was a haze of fine white powder. I ran my finger across it, creating a line before I thought better of it. I decided to consult Arnie. He answered after a single ring. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Everything's fine," I said. "I'm just curious about this white powder." "What white powder?" Arnie asked. "There's a film of white powder on the shelf below the register." "Did the police maybe powder it to collect prints?" "I don't think they took any prints off the truck," Arnie said. "Besides, it wouldn't do them much good. The robber was wearing gloves, and I don't think he ever even touched the counter, although he did reach across it several times." "What could all this white powder be, then? Cocaine?" "I seriously doubt it." "Try sniffing it," Arnie suggested. "What if it really is cocaine?" "Taste it?" "That's even worse." "Why don't you call that Officer Finch up and ask him what to do? I'm sure he'd hurry right over since he seems to think you and he." Arnie sounded aggravated, but it didn't seem fair to blame me for Scott's refusal to stay in the friend zone. "You know there's nothing going on between us." "Well, maybe you'd better tell Scott that." I had a sinking feeling that Arnie and I were about to have a serious falling out, and I wasn't even sure why. "I'm going to taste the powder," I announced. "Stay on the line, just in case I keel over." "Don't do that," Arnie said frantically on the other end of the line. "I won't tease you about Scott anymore." "Too late," I interrupted. "I already tasted it." "What is it?" Arnie demanded. "Are you sure you're all right?" "It's powdered sugar," I told him. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "But we don't keep powdered sugar in the food truck." "No, we don't." "Then how did it get there?" "No idea," I said. "But at least we can rest assured that you probably weren't held up by a cocaine dealer." As I was closing up that evening, I got a call from Scott. "We caught your guy," he told me. "Already?" "Yeah." "Are you sure you've got the right man?" "Well, your friend Arnold was just down here, and he gave a positive identification." "How could he?" "He didn't even see the robber's face." "Well," Scott said, "criminal types aren't very smart." The perp didn't even bother with changing clothes. He was still wearing the same shirt he had on when he held up your food truck. "Is that all you're going on? Couldn't several people in Bray Bay own the same shirt?" "Well, he matched the physical description Arnold gave and also that of your customer." "There are lots of thin men in Bray Bay," I insisted. That wasn't true. Bray Bay is mostly over 60s. Very few men arrive at their 6th or 7th decade still thin as a rail. "He also had the cash on his person," Scott added defensively. "How much?" $300. "But there can't have been less than $500 in the register," I pointed out. "Well, he must have spent some of it already." "What about Arnie's silver dollar?" "Huh? Arnie's lucky silver dollar. It's an old Morgan silver dollar. Has a mustache carved on Lady Liberty." Arnold might have mentioned some silver dollar. "I hope you put it down in the report." "It can't be too valuable if it's been defaced," Scott said. "Not with the price of silver being as low as it is." "Not everything has a purely monetary value," I said. "Did this man you arrested confess?" "No, not yet," said Scott. "He keeps insisting he had nothing to do with it and that he was elsewhere in the neighborhood at the time, but nobody ever confesses unless." That's when I hung up on Officer Finch. I shouldn't have done it, but I was hopping mad. I called up Arnie, and he informed me that what Scott said was true. Arnie had just been down at the station and identified a suspect out of a lineup. But are you sure he's the robber? I pressed him. He was wearing the same yellow plaid shirt, Arnie said. And he's the right body type, but no, I'm not sure. And they didn't find your silver dollar on him? No. Who was the man they arrested? Did you recognize him? I think he's homeless, Arnie said. I've seen him hanging around with that friend of yours, Marge. Marge is a homeless lady who comes by our food truck a few times a week. She sleeps on the porch of the old house downtown that functions as Bray Bay's public library. Scott informed me that he only had $300 on him when they arrested him, I told Arnie. Don't you think they might have gotten the wrong man? Who carries that kind of cash, though? A homeless person without a bank account. He could have just cashed his VA or disability check. Maybe he's been saving up from recycling cans. $300 isn't that much cash for somebody to be carrying around with them, especially someone without a bank account or credit cards. Chapter 4. The next morning, I returned to the supermarket to make a second attempt at ordering Arnie's birthday cake. His birthday was only 2 days away, and given what he'd been through, I didn't want to let the day go by without a proper celebration. This time Jax, the baker, was in. Jax was a tall, thin young man with intense blue eyes. He certainly knew his cakes. By the time I left the bakery, I was far more informed on all the variations of cake than I wanted to be. The man was obsessed. He's worse than usual today, Franny said in a stage whisper when she caught me in the cereal aisle. He's always a little over the top, but when he's in a good mood. That was Jax in a good mood? You could have fooled me. Manic? Maybe. Happy? Not so much. Yeah. When Jax arrived this morning, he announced that he was turning over a new leaf. He wasn't going to gamble anymore. Then he went on about the love of a good woman and how he wasn't going to blow it this time. Did he recently fall in love or something? No, he's been engaged for a while, but last week I overheard him on the phone to a friend saying something about being afraid the engagement was going to be off if he didn't take care of it. Take care of what? I have no idea, said Franny. No ideas at all? No, Franny was looking over her shoulder. I'd better go. I got written up last week by the manager for excessive fraternization with the customers. Huh? I know that sounds bad, but all the manager meant was that he thinks I talk too much. As I was walking out of the supermarket, I ran into Marge. She wasn't carrying her usual black plastic bags, but I figured she'd hidden them in the bushes somewhere. I haven't seen you for a while, I said. Are you doing all right? I'm doing terrible, Marge said. Bobby got arrested yesterday evening. They think he's the one who held up your food truck, but I swear it wasn't him. Marge looked like she was about to cry. Why don't we go down the street to Bert's coffee shop, I suggested. I'll buy us some coffee, and you can tell me all about it. Marge started crying in earnest before we even got our order. I'm not even close to being convinced he did it either, if that helps, I told her. He can't even post bail, Marge wailed. Bobby's going to get charged with armed robbery. Do you know how long people go to prison for that? I didn't, and I didn't think Marge's state of mind would be improved by dwelling on it. Does Bobby have an alibi? I asked. He was with me all the way from noon till after 4. Where were you? Well, we hung out at the park for a while, then we went to the supermarket to check what they'd set out back. Was there anything good? We took some overripe bananas and a box of day-old donuts. What did you do after that? We went down to the beach for a while and ate the donuts. Around 4, we split up. I walked over to the library, and Bobby went to check his mailbox. His mailbox? Bobby has a box at the post office. He has to have somewhere to receive his disability checks. And yesterday, he was expecting his check. Yes. What does he do with his check? The Quick and Pick has a cashing service. He usually goes there. Have you been to see Bobby yet? At the jail? I nodded. I hate jails, Marge said and started crying again. I reached over and patted her hand. I don't think you have too much to worry about, I told Marge. If the money he had on him really did come from just having cashed his disability check, then there will be a record of that at the Quick and Pick. I don't see anyone getting convicted of an armed robbery just because they happen to be the same height and weight as the real robber. Marge looked far from reassured, but at least she stopped crying. What was Bobby wearing yesterday when you went to the beach? A red long-sleeved t-shirt and jeans. Does Bobby own a long-sleeved yellow plaid shirt? Not that I know of, said Marge. But when you live like us, you pick up things here and there. Later, when I called the county jail over in Eagles Rest, I was informed that visiting hours weren't until between the hours of 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. What's more, I had to be on a list of visitors approved by the inmate. I'll ask if the inmate wants to put you on his list, the woman on the other end of the phone suggested. What is his full name? Bobby somebody. We'll need more to go on than that, the woman said and hung up on me. I considered trying to track down Marge again and get Bobby's full name but decided to take the easy way out and call Scott. You want to do what? Scott demanded. I want to talk to the man you arrested. Why? Well, first off, Marge is very upset. Who's Marge? Bobby's girlfriend, if I've read between the lines correctly. Who's Bobby? The man you arrested for holding up our food truck. Can you please just look up his full legal name for me? It can't be confidential information since I'm sure it will be in the paper on Friday when they print who got. All right, Scott said, but I really don't understand why you are doing this. I waited for a full 10 minutes before Scott picked up again. The inmate's name is Robert Thomas, he informed me, then abruptly switched gears. How about we go over to Eagles Rest later this evening and catch a movie? I turned him down. I went to the food truck to open up for lunch. Arnie arrived a few minutes after I did. He was grouchy, and so was Frank, who pointedly ignored my friendly overtures and growled under his breath as he flopped down between the front tires of the truck. Did you sleep well? I asked Arnie, although the circles under his eyes told me he hadn't. Arnie just grunted and started slicing beefsteak tomatoes. I took out another cutting board and started on the onions. Arnie hates doing the onions. Did you happen to notice what Bobby was wearing yesterday? Bobby? The supposed robber they wanted you to identify down at the police station. He was wearing the same plaid shirt, Arnie insisted. I'm sure about that. What was he wearing underneath? I don't know, Arnie said. Why do you ask? Think about it, I urged. I guess he was wearing a long-sleeved shirt underneath. I thought it was weird because it was pretty warm yesterday afternoon, but I could see the sleeves of the t-shirt sticking out past the sleeves of the plaid shirt. What color was it? The t-shirt, I mean. I think it was red, Arnie said. So you remember the man in the police lineup wearing a red t-shirt? Do you remember if the robber was too? Is this an interrogation? Arnie demanded. When you're staring down the business end of a gun, you don't really notice these little details. I let the matter drop. Just as we were getting our first flush of early birds from the Whispering Palms Senior Living Complex down the street, Hank ambled over and ordered a chili dog. "You look a lot more cheerful than the last time I saw you," I told Hank. "You betcha I'm cheerful," Hank said. "I just got the best piece of news I've had in years." "Oh. Did Hank Jr. land a job?" "Better than that. I got a phone call from my son this morning, and Hank Jr. is back home in Montana." "He just took off?" I asked. "I guess you didn't know," Hank said. "After I talked to you yesterday, I went home and found Hank Jr.'s room emptied out. At first, I worried that he'd run off somewhere, but then I found the note he left me." "Oh. He said he'd come up with the money for a bus ticket back home, so he was leaving." "Where'd he come up with cash to buy a bus ticket?" I asked. Chapter 5. "I don't know where he came up with the money for a bus ticket home," said Hank, "and I don't particularly care. I'm just happy he's off my couch." "Let me get this straight," I said. "A few hours after we got held up yesterday, you went home and found out that Hank Jr. had flown the coop." "Yes." Hank was staring at me blankly. He clearly didn't understand what I was getting at, and I was half glad he didn't. I wondered if Hank Jr. was partial to plaid, but then realized it wouldn't do me much good to know. Hank Sr. wore almost nothing but plaid, and it would have been easy for Hank Jr. to swipe a shirt from his grandfather's closet. It seemed that the yellow plaid shirt worn during the robbery must have been discarded by the robber and picked up by Bobby, so I decided to take a different tack. "Are you missing a plaid shirt?" I asked Hank. "Mostly yellow with blue and green checks." "I hate yellow," Hank said. "Wouldn't be caught dead in it." "Does Hank Jr. share your aversion to yellow?" I asked. Hank looked at me like I was losing my mind. "If you'd ever met that boy," Hank said, "you wouldn't ask a question like that. The kid wears black from head to toe." The following afternoon, once the lunch rush was over, I told Arnie I needed to run over to Eagle's Rest to pick up some things from the restaurant supply. That was not a lie, but I omitted to tell Arnie that I was going to make a stop at the county jail while I was at it. I'd called the jail and confirmed that I was on the approved visitors list. I didn't know what to make of Bobby Thomas agreeing to see me. I wasn't sure he even knew who I was. Perhaps Marge had talked about me, or perhaps Bobby was so desperate he'd have agreed to see anyone. At the jail, I went through the metal detector and was ushered into a small cafeteria where a few inmates were receiving visitors. I recognized Bobby sitting at a table by himself. I walked over and sat down. "I'm a friend of Marge," I said. "Does she have a message for me?" "Not exactly, although I can assure you that she is extremely worried about you." "I don't understand what happened," Bobby said. "I was just down the street from the Quick and Pick, minding my own business, when this police car pulled up, and the next thing I knew, they were putting cuffs on me. You understand they think you held up my food truck on Tuesday." "Yeah, they explained why I was getting arrested, but I didn't do it," Bobby insisted. "Please, you have to believe me." "I do believe you," I said. I mostly believed him anyway. "Where did that cash you had on you come from?" "My disability check, I just cashed it at the Quick and Pick." That's what Marge said. "It shouldn't be too hard to prove that part." "I haven't even seen the public defender yet," Bobby said. "What about the shirt you were wearing?" I asked Bobby. "That's the other main reason they're convinced you're the culprit." "I found it draped over a bush by the dumpster out back of the Quick and Pick," Bobby said. "It looked nice and clean, and I liked the color, so I took it. It never occurred to me that someone had thrown it away because they didn't want to be recognized." "You didn't happen to see a Darth Vader mask lying around there, too, did you?" I asked. Bobby said no. I let the matter drop. I tried to reassure Bobby that everything would be all right, but I wasn't very convinced myself. After I left the jail, I headed for the restaurant supply. On the way there, I spotted Jax, the baker, coming out of Jim's pawn shop on Main Street. I slowed down, and as I passed, I watched him in my rearview mirror as he did a little jig on the sidewalk, his long legs flailing and his thin face split in a broad smile. Chapter 6. The next day was Arnie's birthday. On the way to work, I stopped by the supermarket bakery and picked up the birthday cake. "Jax is a wizard with frosting," I said to Franny. "You didn't exaggerate when you told me he's too good for a supermarket bakery." It was a beautiful cake. I'd originally requested a basic sheet cake with "Happy Birthday, Arnie" written on it, but Jax had rejected that idea. Instead, I'd ended up with a replica of the food truck, complete with Arnie and me piped in royal icing into the serving window. Jax had even added Frank peeking out from behind a tire. The cake was perfect. I was impressed at the level of detail, especially considering that Jax hardly ever visited the food truck. I parked around the back of Hank's car wash and unloaded the cake and a package of birthday candles. I stuck my head in at Hank's office. "Come over and help me sing Happy Birthday to Arnie," I told Hank. Hank got up from his chair and followed me over to the food truck. I found out where Hank Jr. got money for his bus ticket home, Hank said as we crossed the parking lot. "Oh. He has an online girlfriend," Hank said. "They game together." My daughter-in-law was livid when she found out. She's worried that Hank Jr. accepted money from some weirdo posing as a 17-year-old girl from Omaha, but I think she's just being overprotective. How did Hank Jr.'s parents find out about his girlfriend? I wanted to make sure the girlfriend wasn't just some story Hank's grandson had concocted to explain his sudden windfall. My daughter-in-law figured out Hank Jr.'s password and got into his phone. She saw a bunch of messages they'd sent each other. That put Hank Jr. out of the running as a robbery suspect, I decided. But I was still curious about something. "Did you ever figure out what happened to your Darth Vader mask?" I asked Hank. "Funny you should ask," said Hank. "I got a visit yesterday afternoon from a very frightened 11-year-old and his mother." "Oh." "It was some kid who walks through the alley every day on the way to school, and he'd noticed the mask through the window. I guess he got it in his head to steal it. The day it went missing, I'd left the door unlocked. I guess while I was around the front, dealing with a clogged washer nozzle, the kid just walked in and took it." "Did the kid bring the mask back?" "Yeah, he was so scared he was shaking. I would have lit into him, but he started to cry. I figure he learned his lesson." "This 11-year-old didn't happen to be freakishly tall for his age, did he?" "Nah," Hank said. "He was a shrimpy little thing." We'd reached the food truck, and I'd paused just out of Arnie's field of vision while I quizzed Hank about the disappearance of his mask. Hank and I tiptoed to the one table farthest from the food truck while I lit the candles with Hank's lighter. I'd just lit the last candle when I heard a low growl come from underneath the food truck. I looked up. It was Emmeline and Buddy, mostly Buddy, that Frank was none too happy to see. I put my finger to my lips and motioned to Emmeline to join us, although I was afraid Frank had already given us away. We crept to the food truck window. Arnie was bending over the grill with his back to us. When we started singing, he jumped. "Make a wish and blow out the candles," I said when we were done singing. Arnie had gone very pink. Every year on his birthday, he tells me not to make a fuss, and every year I do. He doesn't like being the center of attention, but I believe he'd be disappointed if I didn't at least get him a cake. Arnie blew out the candles and went straight back to grilling. As I was picking the candles out of the cake, Emmeline said, "That has to be one of Jax's cakes." It is, I said. You know Jax? We used to date, Emmeline said. We were pretty serious. What's Jax like? Weird, said Emmeline, and obsessive. He goes all in on everything he does. When we broke up. Just then, a ruckus of barks and growls erupted under the food truck. Buddy and Frank were at it again. They've never actually injured each other, but I wouldn't blame a bystander for thinking it was a serious fight. Emmeline and I dragged the dogs apart. I attached Frank's collar to the leash Arnie keeps hooked to the front bumper of the food truck for just such occasions, and Emmeline tied Buddy to the leg of a table. I hear Jax is engaged, I said to Emmeline when I'd gone back to cutting the cake. I heard that too, Emmeline said. I guess he's really into her. I heard he bought her a huge diamond. What's her name? Amber Fry, Emmeline said. She's real pretty. Works behind the counter down at Bert's coffee shop. Coffee, I said. What we need with this cake is coffee. You don't even like coffee, Felicia, Arnie said. He'd finished grilling and come out to join us at the table. I've decided to try and acquire a taste for it. We have coffee here. That instant stuff you keep in case you need an afternoon pick-me-up? That stuff is vile. I'll run down to Bert's and be back in 10 minutes. I knew I was coming off as a real flake, but I didn't care. I wanted to see this Amber person as soon as possible. I hoped she'd be working the counter at Bert's when I got there. I knew my spontaneous trip had been a success when I spotted a pretty waitress wearing a name tag that said Amber on it. You must be Amber Fry, I said as she rang up my order. Somebody told me you were Jax's fiancé. I am, said Amber. She looked down at her left hand. Emmeline hadn't been exaggerating. That diamond was huge. We have a mutual friend, I said. Oh, who? Emmeline Sanchez. Oh. That's a beautiful ring, I said. I love it, Amber said. I was so happy to get it back. Oh, did something happen to it? Chapter 7. My ring dropped down the garbage disposal and got nicked, Amber said. But Jax got it fixed for me. Did he? How very interesting. Rings do have a tendency to slip off when you're doing the dishes, I said. That's why I always take it off when I'm in the kitchen, said Amber, but I guess I shouldn't have left it on the windowsill over the sink. You accidentally knocked it into the disposal? I asked. No, Jax did. He was opening the window. Well, they certainly did a beautiful job repairing it, I said, looking down at the ring. Looks like nothing ever happened to it. When I got back to the food truck with the coffee, everyone suddenly went quiet. I wondered if my odd behavior had been the topic under discussion. I decided I'd better not take off abruptly twice in the same day, and besides, I'd promised to send Arnie home after lunch since it was his birthday. I was forced to wait until the next morning to visit Jim's pawn shop in Eagle's Rest. I'm looking for silver dollars, I told the man behind the counter. Are you Jim? I am, said the man, but if you're looking for collector's coins, we don't have much on hand. Jim pulled out a tray from the glass display case and pointed to a single Eisenhower silver dollar in the jumble of jewelry, pocket knives, and other trinkets of dubious value. Are you sure you don't have any Morgan silver dollars? I persisted. Well, I did have one come in a few days ago, but I don't think it will interest you, Jim told me. It was so damaged that I put it with the stuff to scrap. I'd like to take a look at it anyway, I said. Jim brought out a plastic shoebox full of bits and pieces of broken silver jewelry. He pawed through the top layer, pulled out a silver dollar, and laid it on the glass counter. See what I mean? He said. Some idiot carved a mustache on Lady Liberty. I tried not to act excited. Jim might be one of those honest pawn shop owners who sincerely tries not to traffic in stolen goods, but I had a hunch he wasn't going to be any too happy when he got a visit from the police about Arnie's lucky silver dollar. I'm going to want to buy this silver dollar, I told Jim. Can you hold it for me until tomorrow? I don't do holds. Have a policy against it, Jim told me. But I'll tell you what I will do. I was going to turn this whole box of silver in for scrapping tomorrow, but I'll keep out this silver dollar for you. If you haven't come back for it by the end of next week, though, off she goes to get melted down. I didn't need that silver dollar held until next week. I just needed Jim to keep it on the premises long enough to get an officer from Bray Bay to come sniffing around. I went back out to my truck and called up Scott. When I explained to him what I wanted, he tried to downplay the possibility that Arnie's silver dollar would exonerate Bobby. Robert Thomas was probably the one who took it to the pawn shop in the first place, Scott told me. Then isn't it in everyone's best interest to confirm that before his case goes to trial? I insisted. Officer Finch was forced to concede my point. I'll be over there in half an hour, Scott said. After I visit the pawn shop, you and I can have lunch somewhere. Aren't you on duty? I'm allowed to eat lunch on duty. Well, it will have to be an early lunch, I told him. I have to be back in Bray Bay at 11:30 at the very latest. Arnie. Fine, he said. We can make it quick, but there's something important I need to talk to you about. I waited outside in my truck while Officer Finch went inside Jim's pawn shop. He came back out twice to his patrol car, once for some forms and another time for an evidence bag. 20 minutes later, I had dozed off. Scott woke me up by knocking on the window. I rolled it down. Well, you were right, he said. That silver dollar is a perfect match for the one your cook reported stolen. And what? I'm waiting for you to tell me it wasn't Bobby Thomas who pawned it. Why do I get the feeling that when I do tell you, you won't be one bit surprised? Scott said. Shall I take a wild guess, then? Go ahead. It was Jax Edwards who used that silver dollar as partial payment to get a very expensive diamond engagement ring out of Hawk, I told Officer Finch. I'm also convinced that a bit of investigation on the part of the Bray Bay Police Department will reveal that Jax is also the one who robbed my food truck at gunpoint. It wasn't a real gun, Scott pointed out as if that made a difference. Tell me I'm right, I insisted. You're right, Scott said wearily, although I have no idea how you managed to figure all that out. I'd have lunch with you, I said, except that I imagine you'll be wanting to take that very important evidence back to the station and get on with arresting the real culprit. Fine, said Scott. We can skip lunch, but I have something to say, and I'm not going to put off saying it any longer. Chapter 8. Go ahead, I told Scott after the uncomfortable silence had stretched on for over a minute. What is it that you've been wanting to say? I want to know why you keep turning me down, Scott said. I think that should be painfully obvious, I said. I'm not interested in a relationship. Not with you or anyone else. You used to be. That was a long time ago. But you are interested in someone else, Scott said. Am I? I said. I wasn't aware I was seeing anyone. It must have slipped my mind. Do feel free to inform me as to the identity of this phantom boyfriend of mine. I'm talking about Arnold, and you know it, Scott said. I don't know what you mean, I said, but I could feel my face turning red. How did he know? I think you do know what I mean, Scott said. I know you think I'm a clueless jerk who can't take no for an answer and pathetically hangs on to the past, but I sincerely care about you, and if you're not going to end up with me, then you deserve. I'm going, I said and turned the key in the ignition. Wait, Scott said, taking a firm hold on my driver's side door. I'm not done talking. Well, are you going to be much longer? I have places to be. You probably don't want to hear this, Scott said, but I'm giving you my blessing. What gives you the... I'm just saying, Scott interrupted, I think you should go for it. I know I give Arnold a hard time, but the truth is, he's a good guy. You could do a lot worse. I'll think about it, I said in a small voice. Scott let go of the door. I'll enter this silver dollar into evidence down at the station, Scott said. When we're done with it, I'll call you. Why should you call me? I protested. You know that silver dollar belongs to Arnie. Just thought you might like to deliver it personally, Scott said. Then he leaned in the window and kissed me on the cheek. Normally, if Scott had done something like that, I'd have read him the riot act, but this time it felt like a kiss goodbye. It wasn't until I was halfway back to Bray Bay before I realized there were tears running down my cheeks. The following afternoon Marge came by the food truck. They let Bobby go, was the first thing she said to me. I was afraid she was going to hug me, so I moved a step back. They arrested that baker who works at the supermarket, she continued. I heard he confessed. Who would have thought he'd have done something like that? I tried to look surprised. That's great, Arnie said as he started to whip up a celebratory hamburger for Marge. Most of the time Arnie complains that I give away food, but I had a feeling he wouldn't be raising any objections when I told Marge this one was on the house. I hope you get your money back, Marge said. Oh, I don't think that's very likely, said Arnie. He looked kind of sad as he said it. I hoped that Scott wasn't going to be holding on to that silver dollar much longer, and my hopes were not in vain. A few hours later, as I was wiping down tables outside the food truck, Officer Finch pulled up on the street and waved me over. What does he want? Arnie said. Who knows? He sure does show up here a lot. Are you two fixing to get back together? Funny you should say that, I said. The subject came up just the other day. Arnie went back to flipping burgers with unnecessary vigor as I clambered down from the food truck. When I looked back over my shoulder, he was scowling at the grill. When I got to the patrol car, Officer Finch handed me a manila envelope. It's in there, he said in a low voice as if he was passing contraband goods. So, are you going to tell him? I can't, I said. Why not? We're friends, I said. Arnie is my best friend. So? I'm not ready to tell him. You'll never feel ready. Mind your own business. You are my business. Funny. When I got back to the food truck, I stood outside until Officer Finch had pulled away. I wasn't going to make some grand confession, but I still didn't want an audience. I have something for you, I said, handing off the envelope to Arnie without looking him in the eye. Arnie opened the envelope and took out the silver dollar. He was quiet for a long time, and when I finally got up the nerve to look over at him, his eyes were watering, and he seemed to be swallowing a lot. How, was all he said. I found it at Jim's pawn shop over at Eagle's Rest a couple of days ago. They've been holding it as evidence down at the Bray Bay police station. How did you know to look at Jim's pawn shop? It wasn't exactly a lucky guess, I admitted. But when you love something, it'll eventually come back to you. Arnie looked at me like I was being weird. I was being weird, but that was as close as I was going to get that day to telling Arnie that I loved him. Maybe tomorrow. Or the next day. Or, maybe, a few days after that. The end.